Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a truly enormous subject. It's based on some really exhaustive source material about the Second World War, and specifically about this concept, total war.
Yeah, it's a conflict that just shattered really any previous idea of what war even meant. The scale is almost impossible to wrap your head around sometimes.
Exactly. We're talking about a war that didn't respect borders, didn't have limits in the old sense. It wasn't just armies. It was entire nations, entire populations pitted against each other.
And industry becomes central, doesn't it? Like, national policy is driven by weapon manufacturing. You see this horrific parallel track where industrial output and campaigns of genocide are happening side by side.
And that critical blurring, or really erasure, of the line between soldier and civilian, that was deliberate.
Completely deliberate.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to trace how that idea, total war, went from being this abstract military theory to a devastating global reality. We need to get into the mechanics of how whole societies were mobilized for this.
And how it fundamentally changed the relationship between, ordinary people and war itself. Forever, really.
Yeah. So where do we start? What's the core idea?
Well, the absolute bedrock, I think, is understanding that total war is seen by the nations involved as an existential fight. It's literally survival or annihilation. There's no middle ground perceived.
Okay, so it's life or death for the whole nation.
Exactly. And once you accept that premise, the next step is terrifyingly logical in a way. It means any method, absolutely anything, no matter how immoral or illegal by past standards, becomes legitimate if it helps you win.
Anything goes.
Anything goes. That willingness to just toss out all the old rules, all the limits, that's what makes this so crucial to understand.
Okay, so let's unpack that idea of limitless war, because the theory, it actually goes back much further than WWII, right? We need to talk about Clausewitz.
Yeah, Karl von Clausewitz, Prussian general, writing way back in the 1820s. He's the one who gives us this concept of absolute war.
Absolute war. What did he mean by that specifically?
He was thinking theoretically. If war followed pure logic, he argued, then the political goal would have to be unlimited. You'd have to aim for the complete destruction of the enemy state, erase their political independence entirely. It's the extreme endpoint.
But he didn't think it would actually happen.
That's the key insight, yeah. He thought absolute war was actually unlikely. His reasoning was that the sheer effort involved the political will, the economic mobilization, just the social endurance needed would probably cause societies to just, collapse before they got to that absolute point.
He saw practical limits, human limits, state limits.
Exactly. He couldn't foresee, how could he? The rise of these massive, centrally controlled, industrialized nation states that came later.
States that could impose that kind of discipline, that could mobilize populations on a scale he probably couldn't even imagine.
Right. And World War I, that was the terrifying wake-up call. It showed what industrial power could do on a battlefield. It just smashed the old ways of thinking about war.
So that brings us to Ludendorff.
Precisely. General Erich Ludendorff. He saw the absolute carnage of WWII trench warfare up close. He's the one who really formalized the term total war. He recognized that modern tech and state power meant those limits Clausewitz talked about, they'd been breached.
So WWI showed the potential.
It showed the horrifying potential, yeah. But it was really the totalitarian states in WWII, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Imperial Japan that had the political control, the ideology, and the mobilization capacity to make total war a full-blown reality. Its catastrophic potential was fully unleashed then.
And it wasn't just bigger armies. It's multidimensional, like you said. The level of destruction ramps up massively. Technology accelerates under pressure.
And crucially, the civilian population becomes a target, a resource to be controlled, or an obstacle to be removed. That traditional protection for non-combatants, it gets systematically dismantled by all the major players, maybe at different times, using different methods, but it happens across the board.
And this didn't just appear out of nowhere in 1939. You're saying the groundwork was laid much earlier, in the period between the wars.
Absolutely. You can't understand why nations embrace this horrific path without looking at the so-called peace after World War I.
Ah, Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919. Our sources make it pretty clear this wasn't about long-term stability. It felt more like revenge.
It absolutely did, and it left this incredibly toxic legacy of resentment in Germany, which, of course, Hitler knew exactly how to exploit.
What were the main toxic consequences, as the source puts it?
Well, first, the economic burden was immense. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, placed all the blame on Germany, and attached to that were reparations, billions. eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical sum designed to cripple them.
Impossible to pay, really. And it painted the new German Republic, the Weimar Republic, as weak right from the start.
Exactly. Then you add the territorial losses, all colonies gone, chunks of territory in Europe carved off, and the military restrictions were deeply humiliating. The army slashed to just 100,000 men, no air force, limits on the navy. It wasn't seen as a treaty in Germany, it was the diktat, a dictated peace.
And that feeling, that resentment, it fueled something else, didn't it? This myth. The Dolch das Legend.
The stab in the back legend, yes. Hugely powerful, incredibly destructive myth. The rising right wing, and Hitler especially, pushed this narrative hard. They claimed the German armies weren't actually defeated on the battlefield in 1918.
Right, they argued they were betrayed.
Betrayed by elements back home. Socialists, communists, Jews primarily. They supposedly forced the armistice on an army that could have fought on.
Was this just a cynical lie, or did people actually believe it? Did it genuinely help mobilize support for, well, the next war?
Oh, it was foundational, utterly foundational. It allowed Hitler and others to completely ignore the military reality of the 1918 defeat and redirect all that anger and frustration inwards onto these supposed internal enemies. It directly fueled the demand for Lebensraum, living space, justifying wars of conquest in the East.
The promise being, we'll fight the next war properly without the traitors.
Exactly. And we'll deal with the traitors first. It's chilling. But while this ideology was brewing in Germany, the rest of the world was pinning its hopes on something else entirely. The League of Nations.
Ah, yes, the League. Born out of idealism after WWII. Woodrow Wilson's idea, wasn't it? Collective security, an attack on one is an attack on all. Sounds good on paper.
Sounds great on paper, but it had this massive, fatal flaw right from the very beginning.
Which was?
The United States never joined, Wilson championed it, but the U.S. Congress refused to ratify the treaty. So the world's biggest emerging economic power, the nation that arguably tipped the balance in WWII, was out.
That must have just gutted its authority, its ability to actually enforce anything.
Completely. Crippled it morally and practically. And that weakness got tested very, very quickly.
Okay, let's look at how it failed. The forces point to Manchuria first, 1931.
Right. Japan invades Manchuria. It starts with a manufactured incident, a small explosion on a Japanese-controlled railway. Junior officers in the Kwantung Army use it as a pretext. Within weeks, they've occupied this huge territory, bigger than France and Germany combined.
And the League's response?
Well, the international community was tired of war. They didn't want another conflict. So they commissioned a report, the Lytton Report. It did its job, condemned Japan as the aggressor.
And Japan just ignored it.
Pretty much. They rejected the censure and just walked out of the League in 1933. And nothing happened. No real consequences.
So the message to other aggressive nations was, what? Global rules don't matter if no one's willing to enforce them.
Precisely. Break the rules, grab territory, and you'll probably get away with it. The precedent was set. Then comes the next test. Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. Mussolini looking for imperial glory. Yeah, Mussolini talks about natural expansion, uses another minor border clash as his excuse, but this conflict, it takes the erosion of moral boundaries even further. Because here we see the deliberate, widespread use of outlawed weapons against civilians. Poison gas, mustard gas specifically, used systematically against towns, villages, non-combatants, women, children.
And Mussolini denied it.
Oh, absolutely. He even put out this ridiculous story that the victims actually had leprosy. But the evidence was undeniable. Recovered Italian gas canisters, eyewitness accounts. It was blatant.
And the world's reaction this time? The League.
The sources use the word connived. The world basically connived to avoid taking serious action. The League imposed sanctions, yes, but they were almost laughable.
Laughable how?
They banned things like selling mules and camels to Italy. But crucially, they didn't ban the sale of oil, steel, or coal, the very things Italy needed to fuel its war machine.
So totally ineffective sanctions. Why? Were Britain and France just scared of pushing Mussolini too far?
That seems to be the core of it. They prioritized trying to keep Mussolini on side against the growing threat of Hitler in Europe over enforcing international law or protecting Ethiopia. Stability in Europe trumped justice in Africa.
Which led to that famous, chilling warning from the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie at the League.
Yes. He told them face to face, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." He saw exactly where this was heading. Unrestrained violence against civilians had essentially been given a green light. It was normalized. So if Ethiopia normalized chemical attacks on civilians, the Spanish Civil War becomes the next critical step. 1936 to 39. This is where the specific tactics of total war, especially air power, get tested and refined just before WWII explodes.
Right. It wasn't just a Spanish conflict. It became this international testing ground.
Yeah.
Italy, Germany, the Soviet Union all got involved. It's where we first hear that term, fifth column, isn't it?
That's right. Nationalist General Mola coined it. He was advancing on Madrid with 4 columns of troops, and he boasted he had a 5th column of secret supporters inside the city, ready to rise up and sabotage the defense from within.
And that phrase just took off.
Instantly. It tapped into this deep fear of the enemy within. That paranoia became a huge feature of WWII suspicion, persecution of minorities, internment camps for supposed enemy aliens. The 5th column idea fueled all of that.
But for Hitler, Spain was more than just ideology. It was a military laboratory.
Absolutely. He saw it as a perfect opportunity to trial the tactics that would become blitzkrieg, the coordinated use of tanks and dive bombers. And the culmination of that, the most infamous example, is the bombing of Guernica.
April 1937. The German Condor Legion. This wasn't just a military strike, was it? It was something else.
It was a deliberate experiment in terror bombing. The sources describe the method, and it's chilling. First, just 1 or 2 bombers might fly over, maybe drop a few bombs. This gets people out of their houses, maybe into the town square or shelters, drawing them out. Then, maybe an hour later, the main force arrives. Dozens of planes. They unload huge quantities of high explosives to smash buildings, then incendiaries to start fires. For hours. The goal wasn't just destruction. It was to create panic, chaos, overwhelming fire, and break civilian morale completely.
A blueprint for later bombing campaigns. But this Spanish adventure, it came at a huge cost for one of the participants, didn't it? Italy.
Massive cost for Italy, yeah. Mussolini threw everything into Spain, something like 80,000 troops. Half his navy was involved at various points. Almost his entire air force saw action there.
So what was the consequence of that?
It completely hollowed out Italy's military capacity just before the main event. When Italy joined Hitler in 1940, its forces were depleted, poorly equipped, using outdated gear worn out in Spain. Mussolini's industrial base just couldn't sustain that kind of effort and prepare for a larger war.
Did Hitler realize this at the time? That Italy was basically burning itself out? Or was it only obvious later when Italy struggled so badly?
It's hard to say for sure what Hitler knew, but Germany probably saw Italy's involvement as useful at the time, tying up potential Allied attention. But the reality was Spain proved Italy was an eager partner ideologically, but militarily, very weak. It fatally undermined Mussolini's ability to wage total war alongside Germany.
Okay, let's shift focus eastward. Because while Europe was watching Spain, arguably the real start of WWII was already happening in Asia.
Many historians argue exactly that. July 7th, 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing. This is what triggers Japan's full-scale invasion of China. And right from the outset, this conflict is marked by just horrific violence against civilians.
The most notorious example being the Nanjing Massacre, December 1937.
Yes. After the Chinese capital, Nanjing, fell, the Japanese Imperial Army went on this absolute rampage. The killing was indiscriminate and brutal. We're talking about estimates of 200,000 to 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers murdered in just a few weeks. Mass rape, looting, arson. It was unrestrained horror.
What drove that level of brutality?
Yeah.
The sources mentioned racial attitudes.
Definitely. There was this intense, deeply ingrained racial contempt among many in the Japanese military towards the Chinese. Added to that, there seems to have been a significant breakdown in command discipline. Orders were either unclear or commanders effectively let their troops run wild. The violence itself became a tool of terror, meant to crush Chinese resistance completely.
Erasing the line between combatant and non-combatant in the most brutal way possible.
Exactly. It was a terrifying preview of Japan's imperial ambitions and the methods they were willing to use. But the atrocities weren't just one-sided in terms of targeting civilians.
What do you mean?
Well, consider the Chinese response. In 1938, the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, made this absolutely devastating decision. He ordered his engineers to deliberately breach the dikes holding back the Yellow River.
Break the dams. Why?
It was a desperate, scorched earth tactic. The goal was to create a massive flood to stop the Japanese advance. Use the river itself as a weapon.
And the result?
catastrophic, just unbelievably catastrophic. The floodwaters surged across something like 54,000 square kilometers, an area the size of, well, several European countries. It drowned potentially up to 500,000 of Chiang Kai-shek's own people.
500,000 drowned by their own side.
Yes. And it created maybe 4 or 5 million refugees. It was this single, horrifying act of environmental warfare. It shows just how desperate the struggle was, how total the mindset had become. No cost was too high, even if paid with the lives of your own civilians.
Incredible. And the Japanese tactics continued to evolve too, right? The bombing of Chongqing.
Yes. Chongqing became the temporary wartime capital of China after Nanjing fell. It was deep inland, harder to reach. But the Japanese were relentless. Over several years, they launched sustained bombing raids against the city. We're talking 9,500 sorties, dropping over 20,000 bombs.
Learning from Guernica, refining the terror tactics.
Exactly. They refined the Guernica model, used a mix of high explosives and incendiaries, but they also started using delayed action fuses much more systematically.
Delayed fuses, what was the purpose of that?
Pure psychological terror.
Yeah.
Bombs would fall, maybe not explode immediately. People trying to rescue survivors or fight fires would then be caught in later blasts. It made rescue work incredibly dangerous and just amplified the fear and chaos. Around 15,000 people were killed in Chongqing. It proved, long before the Blitz hit London, that bombers would get through and that civilian populations were now squarely in the crosshairs.
So these horrific tactics, this willingness to target civilians, it all depended on something else, didn't it? The ability to actually wage war on this scale. The industrial power.
Absolutely. The entire concept of total war rests on mobilizing the whole economy, the whole society. And in the 1930s, you see these different models, these different philosophies, all racing towards war footing.
Now let's start with Germany. Hitler's four-year plan, launched in 1936, the goal was autarky.
Yeah, autarky, economic self-sufficiency. The idea was to make Germany independent of foreign imports, especially for raw materials, crucial for war, and to get the entire economy ready for conflict within 4 years. On the surface, to Allied intelligence, it looked incredibly efficient, monolithic, like this perfectly oiled Nazi machine.
But the reality was different. The sources mention chaos.
Beneath the surface, yes, quite a bit of chaos. Hitler's focus on total victory and his, frankly, often chaotic leadership style meant ideology frequently trumped logistics. How else do you end up with German industry producing, get this, 425 different types of aircraft?
425.
And 151 different types of trucks, 150 kinds of motorcycles. Think about the nightmare for spare parts, for maintenance, for training mechanics. It created this massive, unnecessary friction in their own war machine right from the start. They were mobilizing aggressively, yes, but also incredibly inefficiently in some ways.
Okay, contrast that with the Soviet Union under Stalin.
A very different model. Stalin's 5-year plans, starting in the late 1920s, were utterly brutal. They involved state terror on a massive scale, the forced collectivization of agriculture, the persecution and murder or deportation of millions of kulaks, the peasant farmers who resisted.
But the goal was rapid industrialization.
Exactly. At horrific human cost, resources were ruthlessly redirected away from consumer goods, away from sustainable agriculture, and poured into heavy industry, steel, coal, and crucially, armaments.
And did it work? Purely in terms of industrial output for war.
The numbers are stark. In 1927, the Soviets made maybe 500 trucks and cars. By 1940, on the eve of the German invasion, they were producing 200,000 a year. So that singular, brutal focus meant that when Hitler invaded in 1941, the Soviet Union, despite its own internal horrors, had the basic industrial backbone to absorb the initial shock and eventually fight back. It was essential for their survival.
And then the third major player, the U.S., shifting from isolationism
to becoming the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt famously called it. Initially, this was through Lend-Lease, starting in 1941. Basically lending or leasing war supplies to allied nations, particularly Britain, who were running out of cash.
Was this purely generosity, helping allies?
Well, it was partly that, but it was also strategic. The U.S. used its economic muscle through Lend-Lease to push its own agenda, like demanding access to British markets, and it helped shift the global financial center from London towards Washington and the U.S. dollar.
But once the U.S. actually entered the war after Pearl Harbor, its production capacity just exploded, right?
It's staggering. American standardized mass production simply overwhelmed the Axis powers. The numbers tell the story. The U.S. produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany, around 111,000.
Wow.
And think about logistics on the ground. Trucks are vital. The U.S. built almost 2.4 million military trucks. Germany managed about 345,000. That sheer volume, that efficiency on the American factory floor, it was arguably the single most decisive factor in the Allied victory.
And powering these industrial engines required mobilizing entire populations in new ways, especially women. Their roles changed dramatically.
Hugely. The Soviet Union probably had the most extensive mobilization of women, both in industry and directly in combat. You mentioned nearly 1 million women served in the Soviet military.
Yeah, we hear about the famous examples like the Night Witches.
Exactly. The all-female night bomber regiment. Often educated women, volunteers flying these very basic biplanes on incredibly dangerous missions. And female snipers like Ludmila Pavlichenko, credited with over 300 kills. Remarkable figures.
But the reality for most Soviet women, especially on the home front, was much grimmer.
Far grimmer. Millions worked incredibly long hours, 10, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week in factories, mines, heavy industry, often on starvation rations, enduring unbelievable hardship. Their labor and endurance were absolutely critical to the Soviet war effort.
What about in Britain?
Britain also had mandatory mobilization. The National Service Act in 1941 conscripted single women aged 20 to 21 initially, later expanded. The government basically told women where they had to work: factories, shipyards, agriculture, the land army. Civil liberties were definitely curtailed.
But the state offered something in return. Yes, that's an interesting point in the sources. In exchange for this mobilization and loss of freedom, the British state did provide significant social support. Things like really well-run state nurseries for children, subsidized canteens and factories. It was a clear trade-off. Give us your labor for the war effort, and we'll provide these essential supports. And then Germany. Nazi ideology must have clashed with the need for female labor, right? The Kinderküche Kirche idea.
Massively. Children, kitchen, church, that was the Nazi ideal for women. Hitler was very resistant to fully mobilizing women for war production, especially early on. He believed their place was in the home, producing future Aryan soldiers.
So they didn't mobilize women effectively.
Not nearly as effectively as Britain or the USSR. By 1944, the number of women in German industry hadn't actually increased much compared to 1939. They relied much more heavily on other sources of labor. It was only very late in the war, July 1944, when things were desperate, that Goebbels was put in charge of total war mobilization, including women. But by then, it was far too little, too late. It was a significant strategic error driven by ideology. And that reliance on other sources of labor, that brings us to one of the darkest aspects: slave labor. Absolutely critical and utterly horrific. By late 1944, forced labor as prisoners of war, civilians rounded up in occupied territories made up something like 1/3 of the entire workforce inside Germany. That's maybe 8 million people.
8 million slave laborers fueling the Nazi war machine.
Yes, and their treatment varied massively based on Nazi racial ideology. Workers from Western Europe, say France or Belgium, were treated badly, but Polish and Soviet laborers marked with a P or OST badge for East. They were subjected to deliberate policies of starvation, brutal overwork, minimal medical care, and suppression. It was racially motivated exploitation on an industrial scale.
And a similar pattern in Asia, with Japan.
Yes. Japan also relied heavily on conscripted labor, often called ramusha, particularly from occupied territories like Korea and Southeast Asia. They worked in mines, on farms, and on massive construction projects.
The most infamous being the Burma-Thailand Railway.
The Death Railway. Absolutely horrific. Hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asian laborers, alongside Allied prisoners of war, were forced to build this railway under the most brutal conditions imaginable. Disease, starvation, beatings, heat exhaustion. The death toll was enormous. These are often the uncounted victims of the war. Their suffering immense, but often overlooked in the grand narratives. So this ideological commitment to total war, it reaches perhaps its most extreme expression with the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa.
Hitler explicitly called this a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation.
Yes. He made it absolutely clear from the start, this wasn't a traditional war against another state's army. He told his generals the war cannot be conducted in a knightly fashion. It was an ideological crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism, against Slavic peoples deemed racially inferior.
And this ideology was backed up by specific orders, right? Like the Martial Jurisdiction Decree.
That's crucial. This decree effectively removed the prosecution of German soldiers for crimes committed against civilians or partisans in the East. It gave them carte blanche for brutality. Was it just to terrorize the population? Or was it also about indoctrinating the German soldiers themselves, making them complicit?
What do the sources suggest?
Seems like both, really. It certainly unleashed unbelievable brutality and normalized it among the troops, but perhaps even more calculated, more systematic, was the policy of mass murder through deliberate starvation.
The hunger plan.
The Hunger Plan and the broader General Plan, OST, General Plan for the East, these were cold-blooded demographic plans. The idea was to seize food produced in fertile areas like Ukraine and redirect it away from Soviet cities, especially in northern and central Russia, towards the German army and the German population back home.
So literally planning to starve millions to death.
Millions. Potentially up to 30 million Soviet citizens were projected to die from starvation under these plans. It was seen as necessary to secure Lebensraum for German settlers and feed the Reich. An SS officer involved wrote about anticipating mass hunger and mass starvation and mass death on a scale that you'd never seen it before. It wasn't just a byproduct of war, it was a goal of the war.
Just horrifying. Meanwhile, civilians in the West were also being targeted, but primarily from the air through bombing.
Yes, there's a significant shift in Allied strategy. Early on, there was more focus on precision bombing of military or industrial targets, often daylight raids. But these proved incredibly costly in terms of lost aircraft and crews, especially against German air defenses.
So they switched tactics.
They switched to area bombing, night bombing, targeting entire city areas rather than specific factories. The British explicitly justified this as a supreme emergency. The goal wasn't just to hit industry anymore, it was to dehouse the German workforce, destroy morale, disrupt city life, and basically grind the population down.
And this led to the firestorms. Hamburg, July 1943. Operation Gomorrah. That was perhaps the most devastating example. It wasn't just bombing, it was designed almost as a weather weapon. The RAF waited for specific conditions, dry, hot weather. Then they dropped a specific mix of bombs, high explosives first, to blow roofs off, expose timbers, break water mains, followed immediately by tens of thousands of small incendiary bombs to start as many fires as possible all at once.
Exactly. And the sheer concentration of fires created this incredible updraft, a literal firestorm. It sucked oxygen out of the surrounding areas, creating winds of hurricane force that dragged people into the flames. Temperatures reached levels where asphalt melted in the streets.
My God, how many people died?
Estimates are around 45,000 killed in Hamburg in just a few nights, and the physical destruction was immense, 43 million cubic meters of rubble. It was designed to be terrifying, and it was.
Then there's Dresden, February 1945. That's probably even more controversial, isn't it?
Deeply controversial. Dresden was known as the Florence on the Elbe, a beautiful city packed with refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. It had limited military-industrial significance compared to other cities, yet the Allies hit it with overwhelming force, wave after wave of bombers, creating another firestorm.
Tens of thousands killed again. Was there any real military justification? Debatable. Some argue it was aimed at disrupting transport links for troops heading east, but the scale of the bombing seems vastly disproportionate to that goal. Many see it as simply demonstrating overwhelming power, perhaps even sending a message to the Soviets, or just the logical endpoint of the area bombing strategy. If you can destroy a city, you do. Restraint had been abandoned, and Germany had its own terror weapons aimed at civilians, right? The V weapons.
Yes, the V-1 flying bomb, the buzz bomb, and the V-2 rocket.
Yeah.
Technologically advanced for their time, militarily, their impact wasn't decisive. They weren't accurate enough to hit specific targets reliably.
So their main purpose was psychological.
Pure terror. The V-1 had that distinctive engine sound that would suddenly cut out just before it dived, creating intense anxiety. The V-2 was even worse in a way, supersonic, so it arrived without any warning at all. Just a massive explosion out of nowhere. They couldn't win the war, but they could spread fear among British civilians.
And the production of these weapons had its own dark side.
A very dark side. The V weapons were built underground in horrific conditions by slave laborers, primarily from concentration camps like Dora Mittelbau. An estimated 20,000 prisoners died building these weapons of terror. That combination, cutting-edge rocket science built on the backs of dying slaves, is just a chilling symbol of the whole Nazi project.
And the ultimate expression of area bombing, the final step in targeting civilians wholesale. That leads us to the atomic bombs.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945. In a sense, they were the culmination of the area bombing strategy, a single weapon that could obliterate an entire city, making absolutely no distinction between a military base and a school, a factory, or a home.
President Truman's decision. The sources mentioned the calculus involved.
It was an agonizing one, by all accounts. The U.S. military was projecting huge casualties, maybe 500,000 American lives, And even more Japanese lives in a conventional land invasion of Japan, which seemed prepared to fight to the last person.
So the bomb was seen as a way to avoid that, to shorten the war.
That was the primary military justification. End the war quickly, save American lives. Though there were dissenting voices even then, Eisenhower, for instance, apparently argued against using it, but there was also, undoubtedly, a political dimension.
Sending a message to Stalin, to the Soviet Union.
It certainly demonstrated America's unique and terrifying power right as the post-war world was taking shape. Many historians argue the second bomb on Nagasaki was less militarily necessary to force surrender than the first, and perhaps more aimed at reinforcing that political message to the Soviets. It's complex, but it undeniably represents the peak of targeting civilian populations as a strategic tool.
But running parallel to all this military conflict, there was another, even more systematic campaign of annihilation happening. We have to talk about the Holocaust.
Yes, absolutely central, though distinct in its purely ideological motivation. This wasn't primarily about winning the war, although it used the war as cover. It was about enacting Nazi racial ideology through systematic, industrialized mass murder.
And it didn't start with gas chambers. It began much earlier, with laws.
It began with persecution and dehumanization. The Nuremberg laws in 1935 were key. They stripped German Jews of their citizenship, forbade marriage or relationships between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. These opened the floodgates for thousands of other discriminatory laws, isolating Jews from society.
And then came the T4 program. What was that? The T4 euthanasia program. This was the Nazi states program, starting even before the war, to murder Germans deemed unworthy of life, people with physical disabilities or mental illnesses. Crucially, this is where they developed and tested the methods of industrialized killing. Gas chambers disguised as showers, the use of carbon monoxide, the bureaucratic procedures for mass murder. It was a horrific testing ground. And the ghettos, like Warsaw.
The ghettos were the next step, particularly after the invasion of Poland. They weren't meant as permanent places to live. They were concentration points, transit camps. Places like the Warsaw Ghetto crammed hundreds of thousands of people into tiny, walled-off areas with minimal food, sanitation, or medical care.
Conditions designed to kill.
Deliberately. The official daily ration in Warsaw was around 400 calories, sometimes less. Disease was rampant. The sources mentioned tuberculosis alone accounted for maybe 40% of the deaths. The ghettos were instruments of slow death and control, pending the final solution.
And then the killing escalated dramatically with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Einsatzgruppen.
The mobile killing squads, SS and police units that followed the German army into the east. Their specific task was to round up and murder Jews, communist officials, Roma, and other perceived enemies. They didn't use gas chambers initially. They primarily used mass shootings.
At places like Babi Yar near Kyiv.
Babi Yar is one of the most infamous examples. Over 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children murdered in just 2 days in September 1941. The Einsatzgruppen are estimated to have murdered maybe 1.5 million people this way by bullets face to face.
And the truly chilling thing the sources highlight is who was doing this killing. It wasn't just SS fanatics.
That's one of the most disturbing findings. Yes, the SS were involved, but many perpetrators were ordinary German men, middle-aged reserve police officers, regular soldiers drafted into these units. They were mobilized by the state's hateful ideology, dehumanizing propaganda, and peer pressure. They carried out systematic mass murder, often as a bureaucratic task. A day's work.
The banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt later called it.
Precisely. And the premeditated nature, the pride taken in the crime, is captured in things like the Stroop Report.
What was that?
It was a leather-bound photo album compiled by SS General Jürgen Stroop, documenting the brutal suppression and destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. He titled it, "The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw is No More," and had copies made, dedicating one to Himmler and Hitler. It was presented almost like a trophy, a historical record for the future, showcasing the achievement of wiping out the ghetto, utterly chilling evidence of the mindset.
So the war ends, and only then, as Allied troops advanced, did the full horror of the concentration and death camps become undeniable to the wider world.
Yeah, the liberation of camps like Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau, the soldiers who arrived first were utterly unprepared for what they found. At Belsen, when the British arrived in April 45, they found something like 60,000 starving, diseased prisoners surrounded by thousands upon thousands of unburied corpses.
Conditions were so bad that people kept dying, even after liberation.
Tragically, yes. At Belsen, despite the British bringing in food and medical aid, another 10,000 people died in the weeks after liberation. They were just too far gone, weakened by starvation and disease like typhus. The scale of the suffering was almost incomprehensible.
And seeing this, experiencing this shock, it must have created immense pressure to do something, to hold someone accountable.
Absolutely. It directly fueled the demand for justice. This led to the war crimes trials, most famously at Nuremberg for the German leadership and in Tokyo for the Japanese leadership.
And these trials were unprecedented, weren't they? They introduced new legal ideas, fundamentally new. For the first time in international law, individuals were being held criminally responsible for acts committed on behalf of a state. The Nuremberg Charter defined three main categories of crimes: crimes against peace, waging aggressive war, war crimes, violations of the traditional laws of war like killing POWs, and the completely new category of crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity. What did that cover?
That covered the systematic persecution and murder of civilians based on race, religion, or political grounds, things like the Holocaust, even if committed against a state's own citizens, which traditional international law didn't really address. Later, the concept of genocide would be formally defined, largely based on the horrors revealed at Nuremberg.
Were the trials controversial at the time?
There were criticisms. Some argued, particularly regarding the Tokyo trials, that it was victor's justice, applying ex post facto law, making something illegal after it already happened. But overall, the consensus was that something had to be done. Using a formal legal process, however imperfect, was seen as crucial to break the cycle of violence and impunity that had plagued the first half of the 20th century.
And this experience, the sheer devastation of total war and the Holocaust, it spurred other developments too, like modern human rights law.
Absolutely. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and especially the Geneva Conventions of 1949, were direct responses to what happened in WWII. The Fourth Geneva Convention, specifically focused on protecting civilians in wartime, was written precisely because WWII had shown how completely civilians could be targeted. It aimed to reestablish those boundaries that total war had obliterated.
Beyond the legal framework, the war left behind a world physically and demographically shattered. The scale of displacement.
It's almost unbelievable. The source material gives a figure of 175 million people displaced globally by the war and its immediate aftermath. That includes refugees fleeing across borders, forced laborers trying to get home, survivors of camps, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe.
And 90 million displaced just within China alone.
Yes, the scale in Asia was immense too. Just think about the human reality behind those numbers: millions upon millions of people with no homes, separated from families, facing starvation and uncertainty. Rebuilding lives, rebuilding communities was a task that took generations.
And the international efforts to help, like the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRA, and the Marshall Plan for Europe,
Yeah.
were they purely about humanitarian aid?
Well, there was certainly a humanitarian impulse, but let's be clear, they were also deeply strategic, especially the Marshall Plan. The U.S. poured billions, around $13 billion, a huge sum then, into rebuilding Western Europe.
Why?
Partly to create stable democratic allies against the growing influence of the Soviet Union, prevent countries devastated by war from falling into the Red Sea, as the saying went, meaning falling under communist control, and partly, of course, to create stable markets for American exports. So it was a mix of altruism and strategic self-interest, heavily weighted towards the strategic as the Cold War ramped up.
And this emerging Cold War division also affected how refugees were treated.
Definitely. The definition of who counted as a legitimate refugee became highly politicized. Western countries were much more willing to grant asylum to people fleeing communist regimes in Eastern Europe. They fit the narrative of the political refugee escaping tyranny. Compared to, say, people displaced by poverty or internal conflict, who might be increasingly labeled as economic migrants. And crucially, it became politically difficult for the West to forcibly repatriate people back to Soviet-controlled territories if they didn't want to go. So the lines hardened, and the foundations of modern, often politicized refugee law were laid right there in the war's aftermath. #tag outro.
So looking back across this deep dive, we've traced this arc from Clausewitz, thinking about absolute war, but believing it was unlikely.
Right, constrained by the limits he saw in society and the state.
To the 20th century, where industrialization, totalitarian ideology, and 2 world wars smashed those limits, creating the horrifying reality of total war.
A reality where, fundamentally, the distinction between combatant and civilian was deliberately erased and annihilation became a strategic goal.
And the legacy of that, as the sources suggest, is still very much with us. We created international laws, the UN human rights frameworks, all trying to prevent it from happening again.
But the terrifying knowledge remains. We know now that industrialized, state-organized mass slaughter is bureaucratically possible. And depressingly, the sources note that society seemed to find it, well, maybe comparatively easy to slip back into genocidal violence, even after WWII. The capacity is there.
Which leads us to maybe a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to take away from all this. It's drawn from the research into this period. Total war revealed the absolute depths of human cruelty when organized by a state, but perhaps one of the most deeply unsettling findings concerns the perpetrators.
Yeah, the research suggests that many of the ordinary people, that the soldiers, the police, the bureaucrats who carried out these horrific acts, the mass shootings, the guarding of camps, many of them returned to seemingly normal lives afterwards.
Just integrated back into society, sometimes with shocking ease, as if it never happened.
While the survivors, the witnesses, the victims, they carried the trauma, the physical and psychological scars of that industrialized annihilation with them for the rest of their lives. That asymmetry is profoundly disturbing.
It really is. The Second World War, this era of total war, it casts such a long shadow. It shaped our institutions, our politics, our global map, our understanding of human nature itself.
And the responsibility, I think, is on all of us to remember not just the events, but the mechanisms, the ideologies, the technologies, the political failures that allowed it to happen, to ensure that knowledge serves as a permanent warning.